Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Tuesday, May 13th, day 585 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emanuel Fabian. Manny, thanks for joining me as usual.
Hi, Amanda.
A few hours after the final living U.S.-Israeli hostage, Edan Alexander, was released by the Hamas terrorists who kept him captive for 584 days, the IDF began airstrikes on a hospital in Khan Younis, pointing to terrorist operations there. We'll hear more about Edan Alexander's release, how he was tortured in his captivity, his state right now, and also what is happening on the ground in Gaza as we speak. We'll also hear about a major IDF operation in Nablus in the West Bank to take out a terrorist head who is imminently planning an attack on Israeli citizens. And finally, we will learn about the operation that was 43 years in the making to recover the remains of IDF soldier Tzvi Feldman from Syria. All this and much more when we're back. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emanuel Fabian. Air Force One carrying U.S. President Donald Trump has landed in Riyadh this morning, kicking off a 4-day visit. One part of the hoped-for plan will not take place, however, and that is a hoped-for meetup between U.S.-Israeli hostage Edan Alexander and the U.S. president in Qatar. Edan Alexander is resting. He is recuperating after 584 days in Hamas captivity, and he described to some soldiers after he was recovered from the Gaza Strip and placed in IDF hands that he was tortured, kept in a cave, tied up hands and feet for much of these 584 days. Manny, what do we know about Edan's health right now?
So we understand that he is, of course, walking on his feet. And he was smiling when he was embraced by both soldiers initially in Gaza and, of course, his family. But this doesn't always tell the whole story. We know that, of course, in previous hostage releases, just because they look okay doesn't mean they are actually okay. And especially when we're talking about a male soldier, we understand that the male soldiers, not just Edan Alexander, but the other male soldiers still held in captivity, have been held in much worse conditions than other hostages, like you mentioned, kept in cages and tortured regularly to try and extract information from them. So it will take time to really understand everything that he's gone through, and that's why he's being kept in hospital now, probably for the next week or maybe even longer under observation, to really make sure that everything's okay with him. But he is walking and he is smiling, so that's at least good news. And he wasn't the army didn't need to immediately take him to a hospital due to some sort of medical emergency.
He is smiling, and more than that, his parents are smiling. And as a mother myself, I couldn't help but be moved to tears at the reunion of the family. And having children, too, it was just really so natural to see Edan's surprise when he was greeting his siblings. Do you remember what he said, Manny?
He said, I think to one of his brothers, look how massive this kid is. Clearly, I mean, it's been almost 2 years since he'd seen him, and he'd grown up in that time.
Yeah, and what was different yesterday in terms of the hostage handover from the previous ones, of course, was there was no formal ceremony. He wasn't dressed in any kind of uniform. He was dressed as a normal young adult slash teenager would be dressed in, brand name clothing, t-shirt and sneakers. But clearly that does not tell his story. What else was different, in your opinion, as one who has covered so many of these hostage handovers?
So, like you mentioned, there was no ceremony, and it's not the first time there was one hostage that was released without a ceremony, because he was Bedouin and Arab, so that's why Hamas did that. But what is interesting in this case is Alexander is a soldier. He was in the Golani Brigade's 51st Battalion. He was abducted from his army base on October 7. But they didn't dress him in these mock army uniforms like they did in previous releases, and Hamas didn't just do this for the hostage soldiers, the female surveillance soldiers, but they did this for male civilians as well, because they are of fighting age, and Hamas considers all men to be soldiers. And they didn't do this for Alexander, and they didn't do the ceremony. And I think because this sort of deal, his release, was not actually through Israel. It was the Americans speaking to Hamas directly, indirectly, conflicting reports on that. But either way, it wasn't Israel didn't negotiate his release. It was the Americans negotiating his release, and we understand that it was some sort of goodwill measure by Hamas to the Americans, and as such, Hamas sort of toned down their releases. They did publish a picture. Shockingly, it was published by Al Jazeera exclusively. I mean, who else would be publishing this? But they didn't do the whole theatrical event that like they normally do, and they didn't dress him in fake uniform like he also did, and it was a bit more muted than usual. And the timing as well, we heard from Israel that it would be around 6:30, and indeed it was more or less around 6:30. There wasn't any significant delays by Hamas this time, and surprisingly, we haven't seen Hamas publish their own photos from this event. Normally, they publish on their social media videos and pictures, even if they do it quietly. They didn't this time. It was just one image that was aired via Al Jazeera.
One other big change, at least in my opinion, is that there is no negotiated ceasefire right now, meaning the IDF did create a pause during the timing of this handover, but almost immediately afterwards, we saw this airstrike on a hospital in Khan Younis, which killed apparently a Palestinian journalist who became quite notorious after he embedded himself with the Hamas terrorists on October 7th, and of course took pictures for the Associated Press of the terror attack, and no one can forget his selfies on site on October 7th as atrocities were being carried out right behind him. So tell us a little bit about this airstrike, which obviously was not targeting the journalist, right? It was targeting somebody else.
Well, it actually might have been, actually. So Hassan Islah was targeted in an Israeli airstrike a month ago, and the army said at the time that he was a member of Hamas, and the strike was directly targeting him because he was a member of Hamas, and because he was operating under the guise of a journalist. And of course, he infiltrated Kibbutz Nir Oz with the Hamas terrorists during the onslaught. And there's even a picture of the Hamas terrorists blowing up the main gate. He took this video and picture of the main gate to Nir Oz during the onslaught. So it wasn't like he arrived much later. He was there with the first wave of attackers. This strike, the army says in its statement, it hasn't spoken about Hassan yet, but it said it targeted key Hamas terrorists who were operating out of Nasser Hospital in Khan Younis. Just to remind listeners, at Nasser Hospital in Khan Younis, there was a strike about a month ago, which killed Hamas's, I guess, de facto prime minister, who replaced a previous prime minister who was killed in the same month. So the army says the site, the building specifically where the senior Hamas official was killed, I think it was back in March, actually, not more than a month ago now, it is still continued to be used by Hamas and all these key operatives there. And the strike, we don't know how many other people it killed. We haven't really received much information, but at least the photojournalist was killed in this strike, and I guess we'll find out later from the army exactly who it was trying to target. But it wouldn't surprise me if Israel says that it was trying to target the photojournalist. I mean, previously it tried to eliminate him, really not that long ago. According to Palestinian media, he was in the hospital because he was being treated there for his injuries from the previous strike. But we'll wait and see what the army says about that.
Right. And as you mentioned earlier in the program, Edan Alexander was a Golani soldier. And as we're waiting, and there's this massive buildup along the Gaza envelope, many, many tanks were taken from the north to the south over the weekend. As we're waiting, there is one unit that is actually operating in the Gaza Strip at least, and that is the Golanis. And I believe they're in Rafah. Is that correct, Manny?
That's correct. So the Golani Brigade, not all of it though, but most of the brigade is operating in the Junaina neighborhood of Rafah, and that's where the army says is sort of the last Hamas. I wouldn't really call it a stronghold, but definitely the last area where fighting is taking place in Rafah currently. The army estimated there were several dozen Hamas terror operatives in the whole Rafah area a couple weeks ago, and now the fighting is limited just to Junaina, and within the coming weeks, the army expects to wrap up the operation there. And at the same time, if no hostage deal is reached with Hamas by the end of Trump's visit to the region, which is on May 16, which is sort of just later this week, then Israel has warned that it will launch this major offensive in Gaza and also start up the new aid distribution sort of mechanism that it's working on, and that will be also in the Rafah area as far as we understand.
So in the meantime, in terms of the mood in the Gaza Strip for the IDF soldiers, it appears to be a bit of a waiting period, though there are still operations such as destroying tunnels and things of that nature. Correct, Manny?
Yeah, so really the major places of fighting are in Rafah and Junaina in that specific neighborhood. There's operations in other areas of Rafah, destroying infrastructure, destroying tunnels, establishing the new Morag corridor between Rafah and Khan Younis. In the strip's north, there is operations there as well to sort of expand the buffer zone, and there is also fighting taking place there. Not as much as, of course, during intensive periods, but just yesterday during the release of Edan, shortly before the release, when Israel had already paused its main activity in Gaza, the IDF soldiers exchanged fire with Hamas gunmen in the Shaja'iyah neighborhood, the Gaza city's eastern neighborhood, and one soldier was lightly injured in that exchange of fire. So there is still fighting in those areas in the north and in the south, but less intensive, and really most of the army is outside of Gaza gearing up for this major offensive. The army announced over the past couple days that it had moved the paratroopers from southern Syria and the Golan Heights down to southern Israel to prepare, and the Nahal Brigade from the West Bank down to Gaza to prepare for the upcoming offensive. So we're seeing the army move soldiers around, and those two units, Nahal and the paratroopers, were replaced by reservists. So the army's called up reservists to replace the standing army soldiers who are then going to operate in Gaza in the coming weeks.
Let's go to a short break.
Israel Bonds, the heartbeat of solidarity, the powerhouse of support. When the Israeli-Hamas war hit, Israel Bonds stood tall, proving we're more than just an investment, we're a lifeline. Israel Bonds pledges to ensure Israel thrives and flourishes.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military correspondent, Emanuel Fabian. Manny, on Friday, a senior Palestinian Islamic Jihad operative was killed in an operation in the West Bank city of Nablus. The IDF has claimed, at least, that he was imminently going to operate in the state of Israel and conduct a major attack against Israeli civilians. What can you tell us about this operation?
So this operation sort of follows many months of trying to track down this operative, Nur Bitawi. According to the IDF and Shin Bet, he was sort of responsible for activity mainly in the Jenin area. He was involved in, according to the army, the flow of funds to terror operatives in the Jenin area and tried to recruit terrorists to carry out attacks, and he was building explosives. But then a few months ago, he fled Jenin, probably during an operation that the army tried to capture him, to Nablus, and that's where he was sort of hiding. The Shin Bet figured out where he was located. They sent forces there, members of the Yamam, the police counterterrorism unit, and the officers there carried out this tactic known as pressure cooker, escalating the volume of fire against the buildings to try and flush them out. Eventually, the officers used an explosive-laden drone, a small drone that they flew inside the building, and exploded basically on him, and killed Bitawi along with another operative alongside of him. And I think it's important to note that Bitawi, according to a military official I spoke to, they described him as the #1 most wanted terror operative in the West Bank. This man had been wanted for a very, very long time, not just in the last few months when he was identified fleeing Nablus, but fleeing to Nablus, but even beforehand he had been wanted for quite a long time. And of course, the army says he was planning an imminent attack, but he was wanted before that anyway for all his other activity.
All right, let's close our program with a story that is 43 years in the coming. And on Sunday, the Mossad agency and the IDF recovered the remains of Sergeant First Class Tzvi Feldman, who went missing in the First Lebanon War during the Battle of Sultan Yaqub. That's in 1982. And it's just an amazing idea that these bodies are still being recovered so many years later, but it was quite the covert operation deep in the heart of Syria. He fell alongside some 21 other servicemen, but 3 of these men, their bodies were kept in Syria. One man's remains of Sergeant First Class Zachary Baumel was recovered in 2019, and now we have Feldman back in the state of Israel after all these years. So, Manny, what can you tell us about this amazing operation?
So this is an operation that I would say that the efforts began decades ago in 1982 when these 3 soldiers, the 3rd soldier who's still missing, Sergeant First Class Yehuda Katz, when they went missing following the battle. So I'll just sort of go back a little bit with Zachary Baumel. His remains were recovered with Russian assistance, because Russia had at the time a lot of presence in Syria, and his remains were in the Yarmouk Palestinian refugee camp near Damascus. From what we understand, that Feldman's remains were not found in that area, otherwise they would have been returned at the time. They were in another area of Syria. From what we can say, it was dozens of kilometers from Israel's border. So the army described it as the heart of Syria. And this special operation was actually carried out by non-Israeli agents being activated by the Mossad. So the Mossad has what they call assets in other countries. And these assets in Syria they're not Israeli Mossad agents, but they were operating on behalf of the Mossad. And over several months, and especially following the fall of the Assad regime, this sort of allowed an opportunity to try and recover the remains. So the intelligence on the site of where the body was being kept was obtained by the Israeli military intelligence. And then the Mossad sent these agents to go and recover it. And what they did over several months is they recovered findings from this graveyard in Syria and brought them back to Israel. And they would test them to see if it matched Feldman's DNA. And they would do this back and forth many times. And eventually they found remains that matched Feldman's DNA. And alongside these remains that were recovered, and these remains were brought back around 2 weeks ago now. So relatively recently. They also found his tank overalls or coveralls, sort of the clothing that tank soldiers wear. And these coveralls were brought back, and the head of the intelligence missing persons unit, who himself served in the armored corps in his youth, immediately recognized them as being the sort of the uniform that tank soldiers wore back in 1982 when he was also serving in the military. So the findings matched the DNA, and the unit involved in sort of doing this investigation, they did wait quite a while, really nearly 2 weeks to actually notify the family because they wanted to be absolutely sure that it was his remains. And once it was fully confirmed, they notified Feldman's family members. Of course, his parents are no longer alive because this was many, many years ago, nearly 43 years ago. And he was actually buried yesterday in a military funeral.
Manny, thank you so much for sharing that to close out our program, and thank you for all of your insights today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.